and welcome to tonight's very special book launch event featuring two literary luminaries of the world, Michael Lewis and Malcolm Gladwell. I'm Adrienne Brodeur, Executive Director of Aspen Words. And for those of you who are new to us, we're a Colorado-based literary arts nonprofit and program of the Aspen Institute. We're proud to be co-presenting tonight's event with our partners, Health Medicine and Society and Science and Society, both programs of the Aspen Institute. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping items. We'll be using the chat feature to post links throughout the event. And if you'd like to purchase books by tonight's speakers, both of whom have recently published exciting new titles, visit our partner indie bookstore, explorebooksellers.com. Lastly, we've set aside the final 15 minutes of tonight's hour-long program for your questions. You can submit them at any time using the Q&A feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and my colleague Carolyn Torrey will get to as many as possible. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome tonight's speakers. Michael Lewis and Malcolm Gladwell met in the early 90s when both were reporting for the New Republic. Though they write about different topics, both tell deeply human stories through the lens of some larger sphere, be it psychology, finance, politics, sports, or technology. It is, of course, the job of great nonfiction to uncover truths, tell stories, and expose gaps in our knowledge so that in addition to setting the record straight, we are able to learn. And Michael Lewis's The Premonition delivers on every front. It's a riveting portrait of government dysfunction during the looming catastrophe of the pandemic. And yet, pitted against the chaos, we meet a band of medical visionaries, including a 13-year-old girl, a local public health officer, and a secret team of dissenting doctors, unlikely heroes who take on the wall of ignorance that was the official response to COVID-19. A native of New Orleans, Michael Lewis is the author of numerous best-selling books, including Liar's Poker, Moneyball, The Blind Side, The Big Short, Flash Boys, The Undoing Project, and The Fifth Risk. Michael will be joined in conversation by Malcolm Gladwell, the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, What the Dog Saw, and David and Goliath. His most recent book, The Bomber Mafia, weaves together the stories of a Dutch genius and his homemade computer, a band of brothers in central Alabama, a British psychopath, and pyromaniacal chemists at Harvard to examine one of the greatest moral challenges in modern American history. Gladwell is also the co-founder of Pushkin Industries, an audio content company that produces 2 of my favorite podcasts, Revisionist History and Broken Record. It is wonderful to have you both with us this evening. Welcome, Michael Lewis and Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you.
Michael, it's a pleasure. We ride again. I don't know how many times we've done this. I feel like we go back and forth when you do a book and when I do a book.
My job is always just to hold serve.
No, that's nonsense. I want to talk a lot in this conversation about where this book fits, because I was thinking a lot about, you've been telling not just the individual stories, but you've been telling a larger story with your books over the years. It's, I think, really interesting, and it's a very unusual thing for a writer to have done. But before we get that, just give us for those who don't know much about this book, give us the 4-sentence description of what this book is about.
It's me finding people I want to tell the story of the pandemic through, and it's a handful of kids, 3 main characters who are in different parts of the public health industrial complex, and whose efforts to save lives and prevent illness, but leading up to the pandemic and also during the pandemic, sort of expose the various ways the system's broken. I think of the stories that the individual stories, the individual people bouncing up against the problems in the system and exposing them through their deeds. And where it fits in, where for me, the thing that it was a little bit of a different exercise than usual. Normally, I don't launch into a book unless I know I have a structure in mind or I have an idea in mind. And in this case, I really just had these three characters. And before the pandemic, I'd had this notion that what I wanted to do for my next book is take a character, and I had the character. He happened to be a football coach, but it could have been anybody. But it was a character I was entranced by. And I didn't know what the story was going to be, but I was just going to let the character tell the story. And I was going to throw caution to the wind. I was not going to have an outline. I was not going to have even ideas of what the chapters might be. I wasn't going to know where it was going to end. And I sort of ported that idea into this. I just said, okay, I'm going to write about these people. I'm pinning these people to the page is itself a kind of public service. And whatever else that happens. And it was, I know this was supposed to be 4 sentences. I'm sorry, but that's all right though, right? What was really interesting is they ended up giving me a structure that it ended up being in some ways the easiest book I've ever written, possible exception of Moneyball, where it just kind of unfolded, and it was a total delight. So if you ask me, like when my kids would ask me what it's about, I'd say it's about this local public health officer who's the most kick-ass local public health officer in the history of the world. It's about this guy who essentially created the national pandemic strategy and reinvented and reintroduced the notion of social distancing in the Bush White House. And it's about this unbelievably interesting virus hunter who happens to be a biochemist at University of California, San Francisco. And their lives intersect during the pandemic. And that's convenient for narrative reasons, but it's really just about them.
Who did you meet first of those three?
It was curious. I wonder if you've had this experience, but you probably had many experiences of people telling you that you need to write your next book about X or Y. Like they have people out. So I was at dinner 5 years ago with a San Francisco money manager who had taken an interest in the book I wrote, Flash Boys. But the real reason he wanted to have dinner is he said, there's this guy named Joe DeRisi, who's a virus hunter at UCSF, who is a character out of one of your books. You got to go write your next book about him. And he was so insistent that I went and had a sandwich with Joe DeRisi and came away thinking, God, the material is unbelievable. I mean, the stories he was telling he was in the process of setting up something called the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub. Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan had given a bunch of money to create this institution whose ambition, incredibly, is to eliminate disease by the end of the 21st century. And Priscilla Chan had heard Joe DeRisi talk about how he was using genomic technology to hunt viruses 15 years ago, 12 years ago. And she was so awed by him. She thought, who could do this thing? And she thought of him. So I meet him and he's setting up this thing. But I thought I haven't really earned the right to write about him. I don't know. It's so out of left field. It doesn't connect up with anything. I come so green to it. I mean, I got a D in biology my sophomore year in high school. I just felt unqualified. And I told him that. I said, some really great science writer is going to find you and write your story. And it is an unbelievable story. What he was specializing in at the time was hunting down pandemics in animals, like snake pandemics and parrot pandemics. And so he was the one I met first. And I thought, he's just not my material kind of thing. But when our kids' schools closed and this became pretty obviously a serious thing, I called him up and I said, what you doing? And he said, well, the CDC has created a test that doesn't work. So we're creating a test that does work. And we're building a COVID testing lab. So he was, I guess, the first. But I wasn't thinking book. I was just thinking I'm going to noodle around in the pandemic and see what happens at that point. And he just kind of emerged as a book character.
How did you get to to Charity Dean.
So Charity Dean's the main character of the book. And
Yes.
I thought, to the extent the book had any kind of structural tricks to it, I thought it would be neat to take the lowest among us, the person who is on the lowest person on the totem pole in the public health system, these local health officers, and make them, because they actually were the most important, make her the main character. But I got to her. There was like every sign I encountered on the road was pointed to her. Joe DeRisi said at some point, "You got to meet this woman, Charity Dean, who's second in command at the California Department of Health. If there's anybody going to save the state, it's kind of her." And these characters who'd come out of the Bush White House, who had stayed together. There was a group of 7 doctors who, I mean, it sounds preposterous, but they were kind of a little bit of a secret group. They call themselves the Wolverines, and who were well positioned to witness the pandemic, but not really positioned to make decisions for the federal government. They were close to power, but not really in power. And individually, several of them said, "This woman, Charity Dean, is someone you got to meet." And then there was this other group of characters who would help me with my previous book, The Fifth Risk. Obama's chief data scientist, a guy named DJ Patel. DJ had gone to the state of California at Governor Newsom's request, to build a model to help Newsom figure out what to do. And he came away from that saying the model was basically the contents of this woman's brain. It's this woman, Charity Dean. So I had her on my radar by kind of early April, maybe. And but the people at the state said that they wouldn't let me talk to her, and that she wasn't interested in talking to me. That turned out to be not true. I finally hunted her down in kind of early May and got her cell phone, and she said she was happy to talk to me. Before I met her, I had this conviction about a book that stopped at the pandemic. It was a book about all the things that had been done to prepare for it that we didn't end up that other countries ended up using, but we didn't. And when I met her, I thought, no, actually, this is that we're going to keep going here, and that I can organize the book around her. But as I say, I thought of it as much of a character. You know, all these people were so interesting. I mean, never mind the pandemic. They were interesting apart from the pandemic. They were wonderful characters, and I think the three of the strongest characters I've ever had. The only weakness in the 3 main characters was that Joe DeRisi was so good. His stories that came out of him were so good. I felt like I was basically microwaving him and handing him to the reader, that I didn't have to do anything. I just write down what he said, put it in the book, and it all would work out. Yeah. I mean, really, it felt like that.
When I was reading it, I thought, in an earlier, maybe early Michael Lewis, or his alternate version Michael Lewis would make the whole book about Charity Dean, or actually all 3 of them, Carter, Charity, Joe. Earlier Michael Lewis would have picked one and done the whole book on that one person. Am I wrong?
I don't know. I think, I hate to contradict your theories about me, because it's nice that you're saying, I don't want to discourage you from having them, right? I mean, they're all kind of delightful. I don't think because the story was so complicated and they each brought something different to it. In a way, you could think of the 3 characters as the pandemic strategist, the virus hunter, and the battlefield commander on the ground directing the war. Mm-hmm. You could think of them as a shadow team assembled by the writer to allow the reader to fantasize about what such a team might have done if they were running the pandemic and not the Trump administration. And they each brought something so different to the story. I think I would have been reluctant to lose any of them. I think that would have prevented me from just focusing on just one. And they all were learning from each other. So I don't think I would have just settled with one. I felt when I had my cast of characters, I felt like I had a coherent, self-contained story. It didn't leave me. I mean, I left a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor, but I didn't mourn it. I felt like they gave me a feeling of completeness. And I had
Yeah.
this funny feeling with the book. Again, I wonder if you've had this feeling. When I finish a book, sometimes my central nervous system will alert me to what's wrong with it. I mean, all books have problems. There are always ways they could have been better. And I mean, for example, with the Undoing project, I had structural problems I never solved, and I just lived with it. I just couldn't figure out a better way to tell the story. And although I really liked the book, I just had a sense. In this case, I'm so at peace with this that I felt like that's all I can do with this subject. These characters enable me to do everything I could possibly do. If I'd left any of them on the cutting room floor, I would have felt uncomfortable. But I've had no anxiety about the book, which is unusual for me. I usually have some anxiety about the book.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just been a very interesting creative experience.
Yeah, I wasn't, when I said earlier Michael Lewis would have picked one, that was not meant as a criticism. It was meant, you had an embarrassment. This book is about an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah.
You had three, in fact, I read it, and the first thing I thought was, I want to make a list of all the great Michael Lewis characters and ask myself, if we arbitrarily pick Charity Dean, and I don't want to I want people to read the book, so we don't have to go into what made, let's just stipulate, for the sake of discussion, that she is as great a character as you will run across in any work of contemporary nonfiction. To my mind, she's like, I can't even, I was reading about it, I was like, what? This just gets better and better, and I wanted pages, you know me, when you said that you heard a little bit about her growing up, I was like, oh my God, I want 3 chapters on the church. Anyway, that's
no. She needs to write her memoir.
She needs to write a memoir.
That's a separate.
Yeah. I'm gonna do this fun thing. So I sat down and I figured out, okay, I came up with 7, what I consider to be the 7 greatest Michael Lewis characters, and I want you to rank them. Okay.
All right. Yeah.
So. And you can choose other ones if you wish. But
so before we do this, you do realize that you're basically asking me to rank my children by least favorite, by most favorite to least favorite. And so I will do this. I will do this, even though it violates my nature.
Totally violates.
But we'll do this. But we will agree that I reserve the right to change my mind after.
Yes.
Right. So this is a provisional ranking.
Provisional, and we don't have to do a complete ranking. What I'm really interested in is, my initial question is Charity Dean number 1.
Yes.
We put up against, okay, so here's I think the list. Maury Taylor from Losers, who I think those of people who have come to you late in your career need to go back and read Losers, because Losers, I have a very, very warm feeling in my heart for Losers. Jim Clark from The New Thing, another early vintage Michael Lewis book where he's such the Tuohys from Blindside, Billy Bean from Moneyball, Brad Katsuyama from Flash Boys, Danny Kahneman from Undoing, and Charity Dean. Those are I think are. So what I want to know, let's just start. Okay, give me a rough sense of your order there.
So who I would most regret not having been able to write about is Charity Dean. And it was partly because she was basically unknown, and she was clearly had greatness in her, and did not deserve to be unknown. I kind of sensed that even if I never wrote about her, it was a matter of time before the world found out who the woman was. She didn't need me, but I caught her at a great moment, and I thought. The dimensions, she's a literary character. The dimensions of the character were just fabulous, and she could stand alone without a pandemic. She didn't need her situation. Unlike on the other end of the spectrum, Brad Katsuyama, who is just a nice Canadian guy. I mean, he's brave. He's all my characters are brave. Everyone on that list is a brave person. But he's, as a character, I mean, I've told him this. I said, you're kind of like an awful character because there's nothing, there's no edges. There's nothing wrong with him. You know, there's nothing to grab onto. And it just becomes, I can remember when I wrote the first draft of Flash Boys, my editor, and I was trying to kind of get across the essential goodness of Brad Katsuyama, which was interesting in the context of Wall Street. Like, good man on Wall Street all of a sudden is interesting, especially when he's dealing with kind of a messed up market. And the editor said, you know, I'm interested for about 3 paragraphs. And the other 2 pages of about his goodness, you can just cut all these stories you have about, like, you know, how he gave food to a beggar and all this. He said, I don't want to hear any of it. It just gets old. So I would say of all those characters, I'll put Brad Katsuyama at the bottom. Okay. But he'll also be least offended because I've already told him, the problem with this book that I've written is, as a character, you have your limitations. So we have Charity at the top and Brad Katsuyama from Flash Boys at the bottom. Above Brad Katsuyama at the bottom, working our way up, I think I'd put Maury Taylor because he depended. I loved him. I love him. I mean, he's the guy. Nobody knows who he is, probably. So we had to say he was the CEO of Titan Tire and Wheel, who ran for president in 1996. And I was sent out by the New Republic when we were both in Washington to go cover the 96 presidential campaign. And it was, you know, a bunch of Republicans and Bob Dole in the primary, and Clinton and nobody, basically. And the main candidates were so tedious. They were so dull that I was about to shoot myself. And then I got a list of all the people who were going to be on stage at the Iowa debates with Bob Dole. And I saw there's this guy named Maury Taylor. Who is he? And well, it turns out he's a guy who spent $7 million getting 7,000 votes in Iowa and New Hampshire, but he left with the love of everybody who lived in Iowa and New Hampshire. He had these three giant RVs with big speakers on the front, blaring Bruce Springsteen from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, beer kegs on the back, and he'd roll into every town and say, "Party's on me." And then he'd stand up and he'd explain what his principles were. And he was basically like an economic conservative and a social liberal. You know, yeah. you can sleep with whoever you want. I don't care about that. He says, I don't like taxes. You know, he was a really sweet, good, if you can imagine Trump with a big heart. Mm-hmm. You know, he was kind of out of the bowels of American business. And but I went in to see him for the first time. I thought, I'm going to find if any of these other candidates are interesting. And he said, come along, you'll have the best time. You'll have better time with me than any other candidates. So we roll, it is like 8:30 in the morning, and we roll into this giant public school in Ames, Iowa. And he bursts through the doors, like the board, you know, pushing both doors, the doors bang against the wall, and he marches into the auditorium, and all the kids are there to hear the presidential candidate speak, with all the teachers in the back. And there's a certain ceremony that I guess happens there probably a lot because of where they are. And he gets up to the front of the room, and everybody's expecting him, you know, talk about whatever a presidential candidate talks about. And instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out the biggest wad of $100 bills I've ever seen. And he says, "What's the most important thing in life?" And everybody stared at the money. And one of the kids says, like, democracy. And another kid says, like, love. And Maury goes, nah, not love, not democracy. He goes, money. Money's the most important thing. And I was, about 5 minutes into this, I was weeping with laughter. I was out of my chair, kind of almost rolling on the floor. And I was trying to write down the notes, because what came out of his mouth was, and the kids started to cheer, like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And the teachers are all going, oh my God, this is a catastrophe. You know, this was supposed to. So Maury is a fabulous character. So I don't want to write him off, but we're going to slot him in at numbered second to last, because Maury depended on the gravitas of a presidential campaign. For him, if you just get him away if you get him in his own environment, He's just kind of like a great guy, but who will say anything, but the campaign made him a character. So he's second to last. Third to last, I'm looking at, so it's Billy Bean. We have Billy Bean, Jim Clark, and Danny Kahneman left.
And the Tuies.
And the Tuies. Okay.
I think can I jump in and just say, Danny Kahneman didn't need you. I mean, I thought you did a beautiful job, but he didn't need you.
No, he didn't need me. No, so that's probably who we should put next, because that's part of the joy of the character, is the character needs you a little bit. That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Although I'm sorry, he's an unbelievable. If he did need me, he'd be tied, maybe tied with Charity. I mean, he's an unbelievable character. The problem with Danny. The problem with Danny is accessibility. That you think you've gotten to the, you've opened a box and there's a box inside the box, and then there's a box inside that box. And then you think you got to this tiny little box and you open that box and that's the last box. But in fact, there are 8 more boxes that you never get to open. And that's the feeling with him, is I never actually got to the end of him. And the other problem with him is, that's a version of this. His mind, I couldn't get my mind around his mind. My mind cannot encompass his mind. My mind can encompass Maury Taylor's mind, but it can't encompass Danny Kahneman's mind. And so there was a kind of slight mismatch between writer and character, though I loved writing about him. I gotta say that. But we'll put him because of the inaccessibility. He doesn't put it, here it is. Here's what it is. Part of his character is he doesn't want to be known. And there's something about him that doesn't want to be known. He's very elusive. And so that, I'll put that there. Right after that, but that's tied with Jim Clark, because Jim Clark is, as a character, the hardest to write of all these characters. Because Jim Clark, he is the embodiment of Silicon Valley, back at the internet bubble, but also now, even now. Because it's a place that moves forward in part through its disrespect for what has already happened, its lack of attachment to the present or the past. It loves to just to bury whatever happened and move on to the next thing. And he, as a person, is the embodiment of that, and did not form attachments. And he, like, no attachments, not just to the things he created, but also even with people. And so he was always, you think you were on firm ground with him, and then the ground would shift. And that's, as a character, it's very hard to write about a person, to attach the reader to a person who doesn't want to attach to anything. Mm-hmm. So he was the most, of that group, I'll put him where we put him, but he was the most frustrating to write about. He was the hardest. The Tuies are the next in working from bottom to top. Blindside, so Sean Tuohy is a character in my imagination from the time I was 8 years old. I grew up with Sean Tuohy. He was a year older than me, but we were in the same class from kindergarten to 12th grade. And Sean, you knew when you walked onto any field or court that if Sean was on your team, you were going to win. And he was a magnificent athlete. He was not that big. He was like 6'1", weighed 145 pounds when he graduated from high school. But he was drafted by both the Cincinnati Reds and the New Jersey Nets, and held a bunch of SEC assist records as a basketball player. The thing was, he had this uncanny ability to look around, suss the situation out, figure out who was on his team, figure out how to use them, figure out how to use himself, use his talents, and win. So I was on a basketball team with him in 7th and 8th grade. We went 64-0. And we were a little Jewish school. I mean, we were a tiny little, and we beat all the teams in the city. And I was on a baseball team with him. And when Sean walked on the field, you just thought, it's Wayne Gretzky, it's Michael Jordan. When I saw Michael Jordan play, I thought, that's a physically superior person, but that quality, I've seen that before. That's Sean Tuohy. And so to see that play out in a different way, he's going to take this kid into his house who has nothing and has seemingly no prospects, and figure out how to make, how it's all going to work out so they win. I felt like I was watching that all over again. And there's something really satisfying about seeing a character's reprising their traits in different environments and seeing the traits overwhelm the environment. And he's just done it his whole life. He just has won at everything. And he's done it in business. He's done it. He's extraordinary. It was a joy for me to drag a character out of my childhood who just lived in my imagination. I would tell one Sean Toohey story because this is an absolutely true story. And it completely captures how he was in my imagination by about the age of 14. I was a freshman in high school. I was playing other sports, but I'd stopped playing basketball. Sean's dad was the coach of the Isidore Newman high school basketball team. And Sean was on the bench as a freshman. They were a very good team. And they got to the state semifinals against a team from Northern Louisiana that they were physically really outmatched by. The tallest guy on the Newman team was like 6'3", and the team they played had like a 6'11" center. And they weren't supposed to win. They get down to the end of the game, and Sean hasn't played. And they're down by 2 points. I was in the stands. I was in the stands with a friend, my friend Wyatt Aiken. And we were watching, and they're down by 2 points with like 6 seconds left. And Sean's dad calls a timeout. And I turned to Wyatt and I said, he's going to put Sean in because he knows that this is how you win games. You just put Sean on the court. So sure enough, Sean starts whipping off his sweats, and he's little, he's a freshman, and he takes the ball from inbounds. It's 4 dribbles. He pulls up from the half court line, at the half court line, and it's nothing but net. And like there's 7,000 people. This is in the LSU arena. It goes berserk. And he's just like, that's what I do. And so I watched this dude do this over and over. So there was a real love about entering that character, especially. Never mind his wife, who is a whole nother thing. Billy Bean. I loved Billy Bean as a character because he had been on the receiving end of the prejudices that he sought to rectify, and that it had screwed up his life, and that he was very slow to admit it. He was not an open book. He was a tightly closed book, a bit like Danny Kahneman, but I could get to the box within the box within the box. But all of these people everyone on that list is an A or an A+ character. There's no one there who, if someone told you had to write a book about him, you'd despair.
Yeah. But Charity Dean
is special.
I think she's number 1.
I agree. And I was afraid of her at first as a character. And I was afraid of her because her femaleness was so important. And we live in an age where you're discouraged from crossing over race, gender, whatever, writing about someone who's not more or less like you. And her physical attractiveness was I had to describe that. It had an effect on the world around her. And I was worried if that was going to cause me trouble with my readers. But once I just decided, screw it. She's such a good character. I'm doing this. And if I'm banished from American polite society afterwards, so be it.
Why? Wait, expand on that a little bit. I would not have expected you to have said what you just said.
Really?
Yeah.
She's so I felt. Go look at how I described her physically. No, I let other people do it.
I remember. But
and the way her physical presence changes the environment she walks into, and the way it causes prejudices against her. I had to get that across with a very light touch. That was actually just one thing that I thought is going to be a little difficult. The other thing, so Charity, I'll tell you a funny. So Charity, 5 months into our journalistic relationship, where after she's agreed, she's going to trust me. She's going to let me any questions I've got, she's going to answer. She's going to let me wander around her house and inspect all her things and interview all her relatives and all that. There were no barriers. We were driving, so it was more than 5 months. We were driving for the final scene in the book. We were driving for 4 hours to a cemetery in the middle of nowhere on the other side of Palm Springs in the desert to visit a grave she wanted to visit. And I knew it was going to be the final scene in the book. I knew the book was going to end in the cemetery. And I was kind of saying, like, it's been an odd ride. I met you in May. She had already said it. You know me better than either of my two ex-husbands. And you know me better than maybe anyone but my sister. You've gotten to know me that well. And I said, well, what's that process been like? Like having this guy with a notepad scribbling away the whole time. And she said, you know, if you'd asked me that in September, so 4 months into this little journey, she said, I would have said, nothing about this man's process inspires confidence. Yeah. She was so bewildered by how a writer functions compared to a doctor or a local health officer that she's a battalion commander. She is boom, boom, boom. She's her mind does interesting things, but she's an A student, and she's and it's a lot. There's a lot of linearity in her life. And I was kind of like asking her the same questions over and over. She didn't understand why she had to answer it twice. I didn't know the difference between a virus and a bacteria. She said, if you do that on TV, no one's going to read your book. You know, it's just that kind of stuff. And I just had to learn a lot. And she said, if I had not had this track record of writing books that were bestsellers, she'd have been out of there after, soon. And it was only the track record that kept her in. But I thought, what you want, again, you probably have this feeling too. What you want with material is a feeling of a challenge. And I do anyway. I'm playing tennis with my material. And if I'm playing tennis with kind of like the boneheaded guy from the locker room, my game's going to be one thing. But if I'm playing tennis with Roger Federer, my game all of a sudden is better. I may get beat, but it's going to raise the game. And I felt like with her, I had on the other side of the net Roger Federer. And I felt that with Carter Mesher too. I had something on the other side of the net was making me better at what I do, or could make me better at what I do.
Who on that list, and then very briefly, but I'm just curious, the list of 7 we just talked about, if I said to you, your next book has to be a return to one of the 7.
Oh. It would either be Charity Dean with the company she started. It's called the Public Health Company. It's setting out to essentially create a public health system outside the government. If that is going to be its own book, someone will write that. There's a story there. And that's so of the moment. I'd be very tempted by that. But probably Billy Beane, because there is a story that he is, I don't want to blow the story, but he's moved on in ways that actually, and created more narrative material that I might come back to that. But as purely as a character, like there's more stuff, or the character's just interesting enough to want to go spend another 300 pages with him, Charity's probably the top of the list.
I had this thought when I was reading your book. It's something that I've observed in stories I've told as well, and I don't really know what to make of it, which is that when you spend time with experts in a given field about which you know much less than them, the experience doesn't fill you with optimism and hope. It fills you with terror and dread. So let me give you 3 random examples that have just come up recently in my own work.
Right.
I'm just doing a podcast episode on war games. And I was talking to some guy who did a big war game on North Korea. And the point of the game was, if anything happens to North Korea, it is such a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond your worst nightmare. It's just like, you think it'd be easy. It's going to make Afghanistan look like Sunday picnic. Or I remember going to some conference on cybersecurity and had lunch with the guys who run IT for like a bunch of Fortune 500 companies. And at a certain point in the lunch, they're they all start talking about how they don't get satellite radio in their cars. I was like, why? And they're like, oh, because that's the way in. And I'm like, it goes on and on and on about this. Like, every time you hang out with people who have their fingers on some aspect of the real world, it's terrifying. So your book is like the example of this.
Yeah.
Like Charity Dean, just hearing about her life, and Carter, but like particularly just hearing about what it meant to be the chief health officer of Santa Barbara County.
Yeah.
Scared the bejesus.
Yeah. And it should, right? It should. That you could just in her experience trying to stop disease outbreak before COVID, whether it be TB or hepatitis C or HIV, whatever it was, and all the problems she encountered, you could have predicted that if there was a pandemic in America, it was going to be a mess because of how hard the world made it for her to do her job. How, no public servant should have to be as brave as Charity Dean was doing her job. It just shouldn't be. That shouldn't. And she herself, even though she had this very pungent quality of willed bravery in spite of a lot of fears inside of her, she didn't sign up to be as brave as she needed to be, both politically, socially, and actually just being with the disease that you were required to be. And it's amazing. It was amazing to me that material was there and fresh, because it's such dramatic material, right? You could so easily set a Netflix drama inside of a local public health office, and that nobody has done that nobody saw that these people were really interesting and really in a really peculiar situation. It surprised me, but yes, she really knew how to stop disease. She went to great lengths to do it, and hearing the stories are terrifying.
I don't know how many pages it is, 3-4 pages, where you're talking about that guy with the drug-resistant tuberculosis who she's trying to track and
imprison. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, it's more scary than the COVID stuff.
Yeah, it is more scary than the COVID stuff. You'd rather have COVID. Yeah.
So buried in the middle of this book, which here I am sailing along, reliving COVID through the eyes of your characters, and you drop this little bomb on whatever it is, page 210. I was like, and I know a little bit about drug-resistant TB, so maybe I'm softened up a little bit, but that was it's like Santa Barbara County. We're not talking about, some place in rural Texas.
No, I know. But Santa Barbara County is a complicated place. It's a much more, and if you're seeing it through the eyes, I bet there isn't a county in America where if you're seeing it through the eyes of the local public health officer, it doesn't look a bit like Santa Barbara County, because there's an underbelly. There's a part of the place that just isn't for public view. And those are not always, that wasn't always the place where disease spread. I mean, there's a story about the rich doctor's clinic where he's poking people with needles that are infected and infecting them with hepatitis C. But there was so much richness in her experience. And it was especially in her relations with the CDC and trying to do stuff that you can imagine what I felt like when I heard that material, when I heard the stories. And she took me down there, and we wandered around and retraced all her steps. And we went to the morgue where she cut open the body with the garden shears. We kind of went and saw it all. And it was an easy book to write because the material was so good. Did you sense that when you're reading it? Did you think this isn't fair? He got the materials just too. It's not fair to have material like this.
Yeah, well, I don't get jealous reading your books because I can't do the thing you're doing, or it would never have occurred to me. But this one, I did have writer's jealousy. I was like, you got served this insane story on a silver platter.
Yes.
You turned on your tape recorder, and then and that's all you had to do. It's like insane.
It is insane. It's absolutely insane. And that this was there to be told. I couldn't believe it. I've never. It is different from any writing experience I have had. I locked myself in. We bought a little condo down in Laguna Beach, and I basically locked myself in there alone for 3 or 4 different stretches, and it just poured out of me. And I would read it, I'd reread it, and I think, oh my God, I've got a whale by the tail. I just can't believe how good this stuff is. And on the floor, you don't want to overdo it, but for every great Charity Dean story, there were 4 that I didn't have to access. So, and that to move on from Charity Dean, that you had this secret group of doctors who had invented the pandemic strategy, and that the lengths they had gone to do it. All these characters you gave me on the list, one way or another, they're all obsessives, and it's just like the quality in a character you want, obsession. And it almost doesn't matter what they're obsessed about. If they care that much about whatever it is they're doing, the reader will sort of be sucked in and start to care as much as they do. And all these characters cared about disease.
Yeah. Michael, we have to go to, let's take some questions.
Have we actually run out of time already?
Yes, we're at the.
I think have we sucked at this? Have you and I just talked like we would talk and not paid much attention to what we should have been doing?
No, we've done exactly what we were supposed to.
Okay, all right, okay.
I think Carolyn wants to.
It's hard to be the one to cut you both off, but we do have a bunch of questions from the audience. Okay. So I'll jump right in. And some of them are for Malcolm and some for Michael, but I'll start with an anonymous one for Michael. What was it like to write this book up until the 11th hour in a kind of crash publishing process while new events are happening in real time? And how is that different than your process for other books?
I didn't feel pressed. I beat my deadline. It was the problem of what's going to happen with the pandemic was not my problem in the book. My problem in the book was, where do my characters' stories naturally end? And my characters' stories naturally ended about last June, when it became clear to them that the response was a catastrophe, that there was no more they could do to change it, and that they had to turn their eyes from this pandemic to the next one. And that that they were all kind of looking at this and saying, the takeaway here is it could have been a lot worse. It could have killed children. It could have killed more people. It could have created like social collapse, given our inability to handle it. And how do we build something to stop it from happening again? And once I realized that was the end of the book, whatever happened after June was almost beside the point. So I had all my material. It wasn't crashed at the end. And it was written on exactly like I said, for whatever reason, there were two writing experiences I had that this reminded me of. One was The Big Short, because I had this same sort of thing of 3 people who kind of saw it coming in some way, and who were not listened to, who were diagnosing the system in the way the system wasn't able to diagnose itself, in the same way the Big Short characters did. But Moneyball was the thing that reminded me the most of, because Moneyball was, it poured out of me, and it was a year from the moment I met Billy Beane to the moment the book was published. And this was the same thing. It was a year between the time I met Charity Dean and the book was published, and it felt like that was the right amount of time. So it didn't feel, I didn't feel anxious at all about it.
That's great.
Yeah.
And this one kind of related to that, actually came in from one of your Monroe cousins, Michael. What is broken about the system for those who haven't read the book? What's broken about the system that you're writing about in the Premonition?
I gotta ask, which cousin is on this?
The cousin did not identify a name. Just
all right,
Monroe.
That's funny. That's my mother's side of the family. So I'll give the short answer because I want to hear Malcolm be asked some questions. But in the first place, it isn't really a system, our system. It's 3,500 disconnected local health officers with this, yes, federal operation called the Centers for Disease Control. But the Centers for Disease Control actually has no legal authority to tell those people what to do. So there isn't like a lever you can pull in Washington or Atlanta to get all these 3,500 people to move in lockstep. So it's an army that's very hard to wrangle. And they themselves are not very well connected with each other. And they're starved of resources. I mean, ridiculously starved of resources. I spent a bunch of time, everybody should go visit their local health office just to be appalled. What we've done over the past couple of generations there. So that's the first problem. The second problem, to which Charity Dean ends up being the answer, is that the way we structure the status inside this system is the highest status goes to these people at the CDC who don't actually have complete control of the system. They're just kind of snootier than everybody else. And you know, more highly thought of, more, you know, that's you matriculate from the local system to the CDC kind of thing. It's where the elites are. But the elite, this organization that houses the elites, has over a period of a couple of generations, for some structural reasons, but also just like broad cultural reasons, have become very risk averse and figured out that actually sticking your neck out to do the sort of things you need to do to control disease is dangerous. And better to wait until you have all the information before you act. But the problem with disease, by the time you have all the information, which you have is a lot of people are dead. And it was dangerous. Yep, that was bad. Sorry, we didn't control it. You get the COVID response. And they have pushed down the responsibility to be brave onto these local health officers who have very little status, are underpaid and under-resourced. So the screwed up status structure is, to me, a big part of the screwed up system. If I were God, I'd pay the local health officers twice what you pay anybody at the CDC. I'd have them have a lot of control over the resources they get. And the CDC would be a scaled down enterprise. It would be an academic institution. Yeah, they can write the papers about what happened during the war after the war is over. But the war is being fought at the local level. I'll stop there, but those are like a couple of things that are noticeably, glaringly wrong with the system.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll switch gears a little to get a question that's for both of you, and that's from Natalie. What topics do you avoid writing about?
Oh,
that either of you avoid?
Malcolm, why don't you take that first?
Well, I just avoid writing. I mean, I have no interest in things that leave the surface of the earth. I don't do astronomy. I don't do the weather. I don't do any of this stuff. It's got to be.
Gardening. I don't write about plants. I just don't have much interest in plants. I have a rule. I have a general rule, and it's totally conceivable that one day I might develop a Michael Pollan-esque obsession with plants. But my rule is, as I write, is never bore myself. And I'm never quite sure what is going to excite me, but I know when I feel bored. So the rule isn't subject matter. It's sort of the emotions that are coursing through me as I'm doing my job. And if I feel bored with the subject, I drop it. If I feel bored with the material, I drop it. And if you look at this book, I was kind of bored with the pandemic after June, and I just skipped it. I wrote a pandemic book that skipped the pandemic. We don't get to the pandemic until page 180. Right? So I just found what interested me and I wrote about that. And that's my guiding light. I don't feel an obligation to write about anything.
Yeah, definitely heard other writers give the same advice. Don't write it if you're bored by it. And then another one for both of you. Can you tell us a bit more about your friendship and how you know each other?
I met Malcolm. We have a close mutual friend, Jacob Weisberg, who is the co-creator with Malcolm of Pushkin Industries. which is going to be the most important media company of the 22nd century in America. They are so far ahead of their time. Sometimes they're just a week ahead of their time, and sometimes they're 6 months ahead of their time. But I think in some grand way, they're like a century ahead of their time. And they are, so Jacob, every time I've had anything to do with Jacob and Malcolm, I've come away happier for it. And, but we met in Jacob's apartment in Washington in whatever, 1991 or 1992. And we are almost as likely to meet on stage as anywhere else now, right? I mean, we've had a dozen of these things. You live in New York, I live out here. But I have been, from the moment I saw Malcolm's first piece, I have known that I was in the presence of not just a huge talent, but a superior talent. And it's been a joy in my life to have him around to remind me of my own inadequacy. And I think that he plays a kind of role for me. I think however pleased I am with whatever I've done, I can look at something Malcolm's done and say, I can't do that. I just never would be able to do that. My mind wouldn't do that. And so the friendship is more than a friendship. It's sort of like he keeps me in line.
That is excessively kind. I have exactly the same. There was a time after my second book, I was unhappy with the way I was writing. And I felt that I wasn't bringing characters to life. And I studied two writers at that moment to figure out how to do it. One is Janet Malcolm, and one is Michael Lewis. They were two people who did something I desperately wanted to do myself. I don't think I am on either of their levels today, but I am better. I mean, I literally started to read your books and I took notes in the margin and had a legal pad and tried to map out what was going on. And I've always, ever since then, I've always read, I mean, it's like reading this book, Charity Dean, I just was first of all, I had that feeling oh my God, I wish I had gotten there. But also I was just fascinated. I could have talked another hour tonight about, I just really, 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 really want to know about how you set out to capture her on the page. That struck me as such an interesting question because, there's a million ways to do it. Maybe with her, there's no bad way to do it, but there always is a bad way to do it.
There's always a bad way to do it. That's true.
But she was, I just think there's something about your approach that is incredibly unusual and brilliant. I mean, it's just, so I am both a friend of Michael's, but more importantly, I think I am a student of Michael's. And I think I would not have, my books are better for having been exposed to yours.
It's funny that people group us together because I think we kind of do slightly different things, and they rhyme, but it's different. They're just a little different. And I could never write one of your books. It would be so bad. People would put it down after 10 pages if I tried to do you. And I think there's the lesson here is you just do what you can do. And for me, taking a character like Charity Dean and making her sing on the page is like I get the most pleasure doing that than anything. Yeah. And it's like playing an instrument.
Henry Finder, the editor of the New Yorker, one of the great American editors, said of you once that your gift is that you let your characters speak for themselves. So this is, I've thought about this endlessly. It's very rare. Usually what happens when a writer tackles a subject, a person, is at some point they feel compelled to quarrel with them, to question them, to doubt them, to be skeptical about them, to somehow cast doubt on their motivations or you don't do that. You've done all of those characters that I mentioned. In every one of those cases, you let the character define themselves. You weren't quarreling with Maury Taylor. You gave us Maury Taylor. you weren't saying Charity Dean is a symptom of this or this, and she does this one. You just gave us Charity, and you have this feeling, and I've never tested it, I would love to. If we were to gather all of those 7 people on a panel in real life and talk to them, they would all be as you described them. That is what's unusual. And I cannot say that's true of, but not true of Janet Malcolm. If you gather Janet Malcolm's characters on a panel,
oh my,
totally different than she described them. That's her genius. Her genius is that she gets at some dark little place that they're not even aware of. That's not what you do. Like Sean Toohey, I never met Sean Toohey. I know, just from what you said about Sean Toohey today, I feel like I know Sean Toohey. And if I met him, he's going to give me that, the thing that you described.
I mean, I think to the extent there's a secret, it's that I really take unbelievable pleasure in these people. And I'm just trying to let the reader share in that pleasure. Like, I want you to have the experience I just had. You got to get to know this person. And this person's going to teach you about a lot of things too, but just being with them, I want you to feel what that's like. And that's just like the fun in it, doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You definitely do that. And I have the hardest job, which is cutting you both off because we're out of time. But before I close out, I have to let you know that Charity Dean is actually in our audience tonight. And one day I hope we could do a panel with, your 7 top characters from the books. But yeah, really excited that she tuned in. And thank you both for a great conversation, for both of your new books, and for being with us tonight at a time when I'm sure you're both very, very busy. And for everyone in the audience, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't read The Premonition or The Bomber Mafia, make sure you go buy a copy. We have links to Explore Booksellers in the chat, and you won't regret it. And we have one last announcement. This is for Aspen Words. You'll see a slide appear after we disappear here about the deadline for our writers conference, Aspen Autumn Words, happening in September. The deadline to apply for a workshop is next Friday, May 28th. And you can visit aspenwords.org for all of the details. So hopefully you'll feel inspired after this conversation to write your own book or essay. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Michael. And we'll see you next time.
Total pleasure. Bye-bye.